Imagine a continent shattered. World War II had ended, but Europe was far from peace. Cities lay in rubble, factories were bombed out shells, and millions were homeless and starving. The economic machinery of an entire civilization had ground to a halt. There was no trade, no functioning infrastructure, just widespread despair. This wasn't just a humanitarian crisis, it was an open invitation for chaos and a desperate plea for a new kind of intervention, unlike anything the world had ever seen before. With food shortages rampant and industrial production crippled, poverty gripped nations. People burned furniture for warmth and traded on black markets just to survive. The old economic systems, already weakened by the Great Depression, completely collapsed under the weight of war. This breakdown didn't just affect individual lives, it threatened the very fabric of democratic societies. Governments struggled to maintain order, facing mounting pressure from populations who had lost everything, yearning for any solution, no matter how radical. Into this void of despair, a powerful new ideology began to take root: communism. With promises of equality, security, and a radical redistribution of wealth, it resonated deeply with many disillusioned Europeans. Communist parties, often backed and encouraged by the Soviet Union, gained significant traction in countries like France and Italy, threatening to pull them into Moscow's orbit. The Iron Curtain was not yet fully descended, but its shadow was already spreading, casting a chill over Western capitals. Across the Atlantic, the United States, still reeling from the cost of war, watched with growing alarm. They had just fought to preserve democracy, and now its very foundations in Europe seemed on the verge of crumbling. Policymakers in Washington understood that economic instability wasn't just Europe's problem, it was a global threat. If key European nations fell to communism, the geopolitical balance of power would shift dramatically, potentially leading to another, even deadlier global conflict. President Harry S. Truman recognized the urgency. In March of 1947, he articulated what became known as the Truman Doctrine, pledging American support to free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation. While initially focused on Greece and Turkey, it signaled a broader shift in U.S. foreign policy, a commitment to containing Soviet expansion. But military aid alone wouldn't solve Europe's deep-seated economic woes. A far grander, more ambitious plan was needed. That plan would come from an unlikely source: General George C. Marshall. A decorated five-star general and former chief of staff of the Army, Marshall was now Truman's Secretary of State. He wasn't an economist, but he possessed an unparalleled understanding of logistics, strategic planning, and the sheer human will required to rebuild. Marshall knew that without economic stability, political stability was impossible. He saw the big picture, a vision extending far beyond mere military might. On June 5, 1947, Marshall delivered a pivotal commencement address at Harvard University. It was a deceptively humble speech, yet its words would echo through history. He outlined a radical proposal, a massive program of American aid, not as charity, but as an investment in Europe's recovery. Crucially, Marshall stated that the initiative must come from the Europeans themselves, fostering collaboration and ownership over their future, not dictation from Washington. Marshall's vision was clear: restore Europe's economic health, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. This was a bold strategy, recognizing that poverty and desperation were the true breeding grounds for radical ideologies. The aid would target infrastructure, industry, and agriculture, not just provide handouts. It was an economic war on want, a direct challenge to the Soviet narrative that capitalism was failing and communism was the only answer. European nations, initially wary, soon embraced the offer. 16 Western European countries gathered in Paris to draft a joint recovery program, a testament to the collaborative spirit Marshall intended. But not everyone was pleased. The Soviet Union and its satellite states, despite an initial invitation, denounced the plan as dollar imperialism, an attempt to subjugate Europe economically. Moscow forbade its aligned countries from participating, solidifying the economic divide of the continent. Back in Washington, the plan faced a formidable hurdle: the U.S. Congress. Still recovering from the war's expenditures, many lawmakers balked at the astronomical cost. Over $13 billion, an immense sum in 1948, was proposed. There was significant public skepticism and political opposition. How could America justify spending so much abroad when there were still needs at home? It took persuasive arguments and a clear demonstration of the geopolitical stakes to sway public and political opinion. Then came a pivotal event, the Soviet-backed coup in Czechoslovakia in February 1948. This dramatic seizure of power, crushing a fledgling democracy, sent shockwaves through the West. It starkly illustrated the immediate threat of Soviet expansion and validated Marshall's warnings. Suddenly, the abstract concept of containing communism became a tangible, terrifying reality. Public and congressional opinions swiftly shifted in favor of the European Recovery Program. With newfound urgency, Congress approved the Foreign Assistance Act, officially launching the European Recovery Program, or ERP, in April 1948. This wasn't just about sending money. It involved a sophisticated network of agencies and administrators working with European governments. Funds were allocated for raw materials, machinery, food, and fuel. Technical assistance also played a crucial role, helping to modernize industries and improve agricultural practices across the continent. Crucially, the vast majority of Marshall Plan aid came as grants, not loans. This meant European nations wouldn't be burdened by crushing debt, allowing them to focus on rebuilding their economies from the ground up. However, there was a catch. Recipient nations had to set aside counterfund funds in their local currencies. These funds were then used to invest in domestic projects like infrastructure or education, ensuring the aid had a direct and lasting internal impact. The effect was transformative. Within just a few years, European industrial production soared past pre-war levels. New factories equipped with American machinery and technology began churning out goods. Steel production surged, coal mines restarted, and transportation networks were repaired and expanded. This was not merely recovery, it was a modernization, laying the groundwork for Europe's post-war economic boom. The factories, once symbols of destruction, now pulsed with renewed life. Agriculture, too, saw a dramatic resurgence. Marshall Plan funds provided fertilizers, tractors, and scientific expertise. Farmers who had struggled for years with depleted land and outdated methods could now boost yields significantly. Food shortages, a persistent specter in the immediate post-war years, began to diminish. This not only fed the hungry, but also lowered inflation by increasing the supply of essential goods, bringing desperately needed stability to daily life. Beyond the economic numbers, the political dividends were immense. With renewed economic stability, the appeal of communism waned. Citizens saw their governments actively working to improve their lives, rebuilding infrastructure and creating jobs. This bolstered confidence in democratic institutions. Communist parties in France and Italy, which had been on the cusp of power, began to lose ground. The Marshall Plan had, in effect, bought time and stability for democracy to take root once more. The Marshall Plan solidified the Western European alliance, forging strong economic and political ties with the United States. This economic cooperation was a vital precursor to military cooperation. Just 1 year after the ERP began, in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was formed. The economic bond created by the Marshall Plan laid the foundation for a defensive military alliance that would stand as the primary bulwark against Soviet expansion for decades. While the Marshall Plan successfully contained communism in Western Europe, it also deepened the division of the continent. The Iron Curtain, a term popularized by Winston Churchill, became a stark reality. Eastern European nations under Soviet dominance were forced to reject American aid, leading to a separate Soviet-controlled economic bloc. This created a clear economic and ideological fault line across Europe, setting the stage for decades of Cold War confrontation and mistrust. Despite its undeniable successes, the Marshall Plan wasn't without its critics or limitations. Some argue that Europe was already on a path to recovery, and the plan merely accelerated it. Others point out that it disproportionately benefited American businesses and promoted a specific capitalist model. Moreover, the plan didn't solve all of Europe's problems, particularly the challenges of decolonization and internal political tensions, which continued to simmer for years to come. One of the most profound, albeit indirect, legacies of the Marshall Plan was its role in fostering European integration.
The requirement for European nations to coordinate their recovery efforts led to unprecedented levels of cooperation. This spirit of working together, necessitated by the aid, laid important groundwork for future initiatives like the European Coal and Steel Community and ultimately the European Union. It showed that collaboration could overcome centuries of rivalry.
The Marshall Plan cemented America's position as the undisputed leader of the free world. It demonstrated a new kind of global power, one that combined military strength with economic influence and ideological commitment. The U.S. moved from isolationism to active interventionism, using its vast resources to shape the international order. This was the moment the United States truly stepped onto the world stage as a superpower, defining its role for the next half-century. Was $13 billion a good investment? From a purely financial perspective, it was an enormous outlay. But considering the alternative, a communist Western Europe potentially leading to a hot war or a collapse of global trade, the cost was arguably a bargain. The Marshall Plan prevented an economic collapse, fostered democratic stability, and contained Soviet expansion, all while laying the groundwork for decades of prosperity and alliances that endured far beyond the Cold War itself. To this day, the Marshall Plan remains the benchmark for successful foreign aid and strategic economic statecraft. It proved that well-conceived, targeted investment can yield extraordinary geopolitical dividends. It wasn't just about charity, it was about strategic self-interest, recognizing that America's prosperity and security were inextricably linked to a stable, democratic, and economically vibrant Europe. It redefined what aid could accomplish. Ultimately, the Marshall Plan bought time. It gave Western European economies the breathing room to recover, stabilize, and eventually flourish under democratic systems. By contrast, the Soviet-controlled economies of Eastern Europe stagnated, eventually leading to their own collapse decades later. The battle for the hearts and minds of Europe, waged with economic tools rather than missiles, was a decisive early victory for the West, a foundational moment in the broader Cold War struggle. So, the story of the Marshall Plan teaches us a powerful lesson in financial and economic history. Money, when deployed with strategic foresight and a clear understanding of human needs, can be the most potent weapon of all. Not a weapon of destruction, but a tool for reconstruction, for stability, and for peace. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest empires are built not through conquest, but by investing in the prosperity of others, forging alliances that last for generations.